recap 4 years before the break, so we looked at cases of Sullivan and Sullivan, okay, the importance of separate legal liability, separate legal person and limited liability. Now, some of you might ask, right, when you say limited liability, what is it that is being limited? What liability is the individual shareholders being shielded from? Now, if you look at this diagram, right, let's suppose there are 4 shareholders, okay, A, B, C, D, okay, and they decide to set up a company called ABCD Company Limited, let's say. Now, what would happen is, right, they would have, let's say, a maximum authorized capital of $1 million. Now, from a legal perspective, right, this thing called maximum authorized capital has no legal significance. Today, it can be $1 million. Tomorrow, it can be $10 million or even $1 billion. Okay? Now, this thing here, right, has no legal significance as far as limited liability is concerned. Okay? Now, let's suppose the company's share is valued at $1 per share. Okay? Let's suppose the company's valued at $1 per share. Now, let's suppose A, B, C, D, they all decide, okay, they promise to subscribe 100 shares each. Okay, 100 shares, which means they have to pay $100. Now, this here, okay, the amount that they agree to subscribe to, in corporate finance, we call that issued capital. Okay, so in other words, the company has issued 100 shares each to A, B, C, and D. Okay, issued share capital. Now, the guys have agreed to subscribe 100 each, right? Which means mathematically they would have to pay $100 each. Now, let's suppose we have a scenario where A and B, okay, have paid up their money, $100 each, and C has only paid $50, and D has not paid anything yet. Now, in corporate finance, we call this paid up share capital. In other words, the shareholders have already paid the company that amount. Paid up share capital. Now, let's suppose this scenario remains, and let's suppose the company now goes into liquidation. Now, the first question you would ask yourself is, so let's suppose there are no other debts, okay? In a simple scenario, let's suppose the company has no other debts. So what would be the liability of each of A, B, C, and D? Anyone want to guess what's the liability of A? Sorry? What would be the liability of A?
$100.
Is it? What would be the liability of A in this scenario?
To repeat the question, please.
Okay, supposing the company now goes into liquidation. And let's suppose, for our simple example, the company has no other debts. And supposing this scenario remains at liquidation. What is the liability of A?
So, sorry, what was the distribution of their shares again?
Okay, let's suppose they agree, okay, to subscribe 100 shares each. In a simple scenario. And let's suppose, okay, for our sake, okay, let's suppose they all hold 25% of the company. Now, what would be the liability of A in this case? Supposing the company goes into liquidation.
Well, it depends, right? I think if we were looking at it from a very general basis, then you would only be liable on the basis of that 100 shares which were issued to, right?
And supposing you pay that.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
What? No liability, right? 0. Why? Because he agreed to subscribe to 100 shares at $1 per share, and he has paid up that $100. So when the company goes into liquidation, his liability 0. Same for B, okay? For that same reason, 0. And the liability of C, 50, and the liability 100. Now, this here is what we mean by limited liability. This is, technically speaking, this is what we mean by limited liability. So in other words, the liability of an individual shareholder is only up to the amount of shares which he agreed to subscribe to at the first place. Now, of course, in reality, okay, it's a lot more complicated than that, okay, because the company may incur other debts, okay, but that's something we'll deal with later, okay. But as far as limited liability is concerned, okay, this is what we mean. Any questions? Now, another issue which we'll also touch upon, right? About the case about Salomon, right? Now, if a company goes into liquidation, okay, and supposing a company has a lot of debts, so they have a lot of creditors, okay? Now, in general, creditors are ranked according to this priority. Secure creditor, preferred or preferential creditor, and unsecured creditor. Now, this is something which we'll touch upon in more details later on, but I'll just briefly explain, okay? Anybody want to guess who are the unsecured creditors of a company?
Just lenders on money.
Okay, customers, okay, for example, okay, customers, unsecured creditors. Preferred creditors includes employees and government. Okay, so for example, your tax still needs to be paid. Wages of employees also need to be paid first. And secure creditors, what I guess? What are they? Usually.
Mortgage.
Yes, banks, okay? The most powerful groups in a society. Banks, lending houses. Now, what Mr. Salomon did was, right, by issuing a bond to himself, okay, he held a bond issued by Salomon Co. He was able, okay, to become a secure creditor. So in other words, when the company went bust, he was able to rank ahead of these creditors and was able to get his money back from the company. Now, because, remember, right, what happened in that case was the liquidator, they represented the interest of unsecured creditor. So what they wanted was, right, they wanted to exclude the bond held by Mr. Salomon so that there will be more money in the pool to repay the unsecured creditors. Now, because 9 times out of 10, as I mentioned earlier, right, when a company goes into liquidation, the assets available in the company would not be sufficient to satisfy all the creditors. So all the creditors would try to argue that their interests should be ranked ahead of others. Now, in reality, how do we differentiate these creditors is something that we'll look at later on in the course. Now, but the question you might ask yourself, well, in today's company law, can a shareholder lend money to the company? Now, the answer to that question is yes, but subject to many restrictions. Again, we'll look at that later. Yes, as a shareholder, you can still lend money to your company. but there are many restrictions, especially, as we'll look at later, especially if it is a publicly listed company. Right, any questions before we move on? So just before break, so we're looking at the types of company, okay? And what I said was, the two types of companies that we'll be dealing with this course mainly is private companies limited by shares, and as we'll look at later also, public limited companies limited by shares. Now, as I said, right, company limited by shares, okay, that's our main focus. Private or public limited companies by shares, that's our main focus. So what are companies limited by guarantee then? Now, generally speaking, right, companies limited by guarantee are usually used by organizations like charities. Now, generally speaking, at law, they have no power to issue shares. Now, the reason why it's called by guarantee, now what is it that they are guaranteeing? The members, the shareholders, are guaranteeing that they would pay up should the companies wind up, and if the company's asset fall short of expectation. So in other words, if the companies wind up and there isn't enough assets or capital to distribute to the creditors, then the members guarantee that they will pay up. That's why it's called companies limited by guarantee. And that's the reason, okay, also why no private business would operate under this term. Okay, these are usually, okay, charities, for example. And that liability, okay, can be a fixed amount. So, as point number D says, right, suitable for non-trading organizations, charities, for example. Now, from time to time, you'll also hear this term called unlimited companies. Again, it's very, very rare. And if you check the company register, currently in Hong Kong there's only about 100 or 150 organizations that are registered as such. Now, as the title suggests, right, the fact that it is unlimited, technically speaking, means the liability of the members can be unlimited. When we say that for a company, right, liability is limited, whereas for an unlimited company, technically speaking, the liability can be unlimited. Also, liability is severable. What does that mean? For those of you who have done talk, what does that mean? What does joint and severable liability mean?
Each person may be required to pay up to the full amount,
even though if he or she was not responsible for that act. Okay, so for example, right, in a partnership, okay, we said that partners are jointly and severably liable for each other. Which means if your partner conducts something, let's say he conducts a fraud, and he's found liable, even though you, the other partner, was not involved in that act, you can still be held liable. Okay, that's what we mean by joint and several liability, okay, in total. Now, what kind of business organization chooses this kind of business form? As I mentioned earlier, professional bodies, accounting firms, law firms. Now, an unlimited life company, right, is more or less like a partnership business. Now, because in law firm, right, when you go into practice in law firm, right, lawyers refer to each other as partners, sometimes senior partners. That's what we mean by that, okay? Because almost all law firms in Hong Kong are registered under a partnership. Okay, almost all law firms in Hong Kong registered under a partnership. Which means, right, the partners, as I mentioned earlier, they are jointly and severally liable for each other. And that's why what you would see is in almost all law firms and accounting firms, they would have what we call liability insurance. So in case one partner commits tort and is held liable, that insurance, okay, policy would then be used to pay off the plaintiff. Now, from time to time in your text, you would see a term called proprietary company. Now, proprietary company is not very prevalent here in Hong Kong, but it is quite prevalent in other parts of the world. Now, the feature of a proprietary company is that it must be limited by shares, and there is a very high restriction on the right to transfer shares. Now, usually these are family businesses. So, for example, right, if you want your business only held by your family members. And it must not have more than 50 non-employee shareholders, okay? Shareholders numbers capped at 50. And of course, most important of all, because it is a family, or what we call a closely held corporation, they must not offer shares or debentures to the public. Now, what is the advantage of that kind of company? The advantage is that it has very lax regulation. Okay? It is regulated by very lax company regulations. The requirement is you only need one director. You don't need to lodge your financial statements with the register. And more importantly, as we'll look at later, restriction on the company lending money to its directors also less restricted. But because it is usually a family business, right? So you can do your family matters within that company in whatever way or whatever format you want. And more importantly, as far as formality is concerned, okay, there is also no requirement of an annual general meeting. Now, because by law, as we'll look at later, every company is required to hold an annual general meeting, even though you are a private company or a small business. But for most private companies these days, right, the formality, okay, is basically forgotten. And this goes back to the first point that we mentioned, right? The reason, okay, is to encourage the setup of small and medium enterprises, to encourage investment. Now, so what are public companies, okay? Those companies that you read in the newspaper, in the finance section of newspapers on a daily basis, okay? These are what we call publicly listed companies or public companies. So in other words, those companies that issue shares to the public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, for example. HSBC, for example. Now, the definition of a public company is provided under Section 12 of the Companies Ordinance, which you can have a look. Now, for a public company, the most important thing is, right, the number of shareholders are unlimited. Now, what that means, when we say unlimited, what that means is, right, the company is free to issue more shares in order to sell to the public, and which they always do. So, for example, right, if a publicly listed company decides that they want to raise capital, they would either borrow that money from the bank, or they would fund for the expansion by the issuing of shares to the public. Now, of course, if you're a publicly listed company, regulation is, of course, a lot more stricter than a private limited company. The reason? Because it involves public interest. But because you and I who buy shares in these companies, right? We also have a stake in that company. Because we are also investing our money in that company. So the regulation is, of course, a lot more stricter than a private limited company. Now, the requirement in Hong Kong, according to the stock exchange, right? A company is regarded as a publicly listed company if at least 25% of its shares are sold to the public in the open market. Okay? At least 25% of the shares are held by the public in open market. Now, actually, that threshold, if you think about it, right, is actually not very high. So in other words, in Hong Kong, you can actually have a family or an individual holding 75% of that shares and selling the remaining 25%. That is, by law, still regarded as a publicly listed company. Now, we have an example of that, which is, of course, the MTR. The MTR, for example, right, is 75% held by the Hong Kong government. Only 25% of MTR are actually sold in the open market. Of course, the major feature of a publicly listed company is that, right? The shares are traded in the open exchange, and each publicly listed company must have a minimum director of 2 people. Now, of course, in reality, okay, most listed companies have many directors. But the requirement, okay, the minimum requirement is only 2. And most important of all, annual general meeting is a must. Okay, annual general meeting is a must. Now, from time to time, you will read in the newspaper, some public companies decide to, quote, privatize. Now, basically what that means is, right, they're changing their status from a public company back to a private limited company. Now, some companies have done that. In fact, quite a lot of companies have done that. Now, the reason for that is because, right, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of public companies, okay, they are governed by stricter regulations. Like disclosure, for example. The requirement of annual general meeting. The rules on directors' duties, etc., etc. Or the rules set out by the stock exchange. Now, the reason why a lot of public companies decide to go back to private is because, especially here in Hong Kong, right, most publicly listed companies are family controlled. So they may then decide that the company, okay, is better to be held by family members rather than by the public. Right. any questions with what we have done today? Now, for the purpose of your tutorial 2, okay, make sure you read the case Salomon versus Salomon in detail, right? And that's something we'll discuss in details in tutorial 2. Now, for tutorial 1, what we'll do is, okay, your tutor, myself, and Dr. Lin, will briefly go through the law on partnership. Okay, for the first tutor, or your introductory tutor, okay, tutorial, we will go through the law on partnership review.
It's Friday.